Nightmare neighbor from hell stole my parking spot daily. Insisted it was her legal right. I called police and HOA. Then she escalated into full revenge modi everyone. I'm Marcus, and I need to tell you about the most insane neighbor situation I've ever experienced. What started as a simple parking dispute turned into a full-blown war that consumed my life for 6 months and nearly drove me to move out of my own home. This is the story of how one entitled woman tried to claim ownership of my property and then made my existence a living hell when I dared to fight back. I should start by saying I'm generally a peaceful guy. I am 32, work as an accountant, and I've lived in the same suburban neighborhood for 5 years without any major issues with neighbors. My house is a modest 2-bedroom ranch with a nice driveway that can comfortably fit 2 cars. I live alone, so most of the time, my driveway sits half empty, which apparently gave someone the wrong idea about ownership rights. The trouble started when the Hendersons moved out of the house next door and were replaced by a woman named Linda Krotowski. Linda was probably in her late 40s, recently divorced according to the neighborhood gossip, and had an attitude that could be described as aggressively entitled from day one. She had short, bleached blonde hair, always wore oversized sunglasses, and drove a massive white SUV that she treated like a weapon. The first red flag should have been during her move-in process. Instead of using her own driveway, she had the moving truck park partially in mine, blocking my access to my garage. When I politely approached her to ask if they could move it, she looked at me like I was speaking a foreign language. It's just for a few hours, she said dismissively, waving her hand like she was shooing away a fly. Don't be so uptight about it. I let it slide because moving is stressful, and I figured once she was settled, things would normalize. Boy, was I wrong. The real problems began about a week after Linda moved in. I came home from work on a Tuesday evening to find her white SUV parked squarely in my driveway, right where I always park my car. Not partially in my driveway, not accidentally over the line, fully, completely, intentionally parked in the middle of my driveway. I sat in my car for a moment, staring at this scene in disbelief. Then I walked over to her front door and knocked. Linda answered wearing a bathrobe and those same oversized sunglasses, despite it being evening. "Excuse me, Linda," I said as politely as possible, "but you're parked in my driveway. Could you please move your car?" She looked at me with this blank expression, then glanced toward the driveway as if seeing her car there for the first time. "Oh, that," she said with a shrug. "Yeah, I'm going to be parking there from now on. My driveway slopes too much, and it's bad for my transmission." I blinked a few times, certain I had misheard her. "I'm sorry, what? You can't park in my driveway. It's my property." Linda crossed her arms and tilted her head like she was explaining something obvious to a child. "Actually, I looked it up, and driveways that connect to public streets are considered public access points. You can't legally prevent someone from using them if they're not blocking traffic flow." I was so stunned by the sheer audacity and legal nonsense she was spouting that I couldn't immediately respond. She used my silence as an opportunity to continue. "Besides, you live alone and only have 1 car. You are not even using the space. I have a right to park somewhere safe for my vehicle. That's not how property ownership works," I managed to say. "This is my driveway on my property that I pay taxes on. You need to move your car immediately." Linda's demeanor shifted from fake sweet to openly hostile. "I'm not moving anything. If you have a problem with it, call someone who cares." And with that, she slammed the door in my face. I stood there for a moment, processing what had just happened. Then I walked back to my car, which was still sitting in the street, and drove around the block a few times to cool down and think about my options. When I returned, Linda's car was still there, and now there was a note tucked under my windshield wiper, in scratchy handwriting. It read, "Marcus, I talked to my lawyer friend and confirmed that you cannot prevent me from parking in the driveway. Please don't harass me about this again." Linda, that night, I had to park on the street, which was particularly annoying because street parking in our neighborhood is limited, and I ended up 3 houses down from my own home. I spent the evening researching property laws online, and of course, Linda was completely wrong. A private driveway is exactly that, private property. No one has the right to park there without the owner's permission, regardless of how it connects to the street. The next morning, I went outside hoping to find my driveway empty, but Linda's SUV was still there. Worse, she was sitting in it, drinking coffee and scrolling through her phone like she was hanging out in her own personal parking spot. I knocked on her window, and she rolled it down with an exaggerated sigh. Linda, you really need to move your car. I need to get into my garage, so go around, she said without looking up from her phone. There's plenty of room. She was right that I could technically squeeze past her car to reach my garage, but that wasn't the point. This was my property, and she was trespassing. That's not the issue. The issue is that you're parked on my private property without permission. Linda finally looked at me, and I saw something genuinely unsettling in her eyes, a kind of gleeful malice. Like she was enjoying this confrontation. Prove it's private property, she said with a smirk. Show me the survey markers. Show me the deed that specifically mentions this exact piece of concrete. Until then, I'm parking here. That evening, Linda's car was gone when I got home from work, and I felt a brief moment of relief, thinking maybe she'd come to her senses. But the next morning, there it was again, parked in the exact same spot. This pattern continued for a week. Every morning, Linda's SUV would be in my driveway. Sometimes she'd be sitting in it when I left for work, always with that same smug expression. Sometimes she'd emerge from her house as I was trying to navigate around her car, making comments like, "Careful now. Wouldn't want you to scratch my vehicle," or "Maybe you should consider getting a smaller car if parking is such a problem for you." By the end of that first week, I was at my breaking point. I decided to call the police non-emergency line to report the trespassing. The dispatcher was sympathetic and said they'd send an officer out to speak with both of us. Officer Rodriguez arrived about an hour later and listened patiently as I explained the situation. He then went next door to speak with Linda, and I could hear raised voices coming from her front yard, though I couldn't make out the specific words. When Officer Rodriguez came back to speak with me, he looked frustrated. "Sir, I've explained to your neighbor that she cannot park on your private property without permission, and I've advised her to move her vehicle immediately. She's resistant to the information, but she's been warned that continued trespassing could result in her vehicle being towed at her expense." "What did she say?" I asked. Officer Rodriguez shook his head. "She insisted that she has a legal right to park there and threatened to file a complaint against the police department for harassment. She also mentioned something about having connections at City Hall, though I'm not sure what that was supposed to mean." The officer's visit worked for exactly one day. Linda's car was gone that evening and the next morning, but by Thursday, it was back in my driveway like nothing had happened. That's when I decided to contact our homeowners association. Our neighborhood isn't gated or particularly exclusive, but we do have an HOA that handles disputes between neighbors and enforces certain community standards. I called the HOA president, a retired teacher named Mrs. Chen, and explained the situation. She was appalled and promised to send Linda a formal letter reminding her of the community rules about respecting neighbors' property rights. The HOA letter arrived on a Friday, and Linda's response was swift and dramatic. That weekend, she escalated from merely parking in my driveway to what I can only describe as psychological warfare. It started Saturday morning, when I woke up to find that Linda had parked not just in my driveway, but had positioned her SUV in such a way that it blocked my garage door completely. When I went outside to assess the situation, I found Linda in her front yard, watering plants with a garden hose. "Excuse me," I called out. "Your car is blocking my garage." Without turning around, Linda replied, "Is it?" "I hadn't noticed." "I'll move it when I'm done with my yard work." "When will that be?" "Oh, you know how it is. Yard work takes as long as it takes. Could be an hour, could be all day." I realized she was deliberately trying to trap me in my own home. Since my garage was blocked and her SUV was positioned to take up most of the driveway width, I couldn't get my car out even to park on the street. That's when things got really weird. Over the next few hours, Linda began what I can only describe as a campaign of petty harassment. She set up a boombox in her front yard and played music loud enough that I could hear it clearly inside my house with the windows closed. Not just any music, children's songs and nursery rhymes on repeat. When the music didn't get the reaction she wanted, Linda escalated to more direct methods. She began walking through my front yard, claiming she was checking for property line violations. She'd stand at the edge of my driveway with a measuring tape, taking photos and making notes in a small notebook. Sunday morning, I woke up to find Linda had set up a lawn chair in my driveway, right next to her parked SUV. She was sitting there drinking coffee and reading a newspaper like she was camping out. When I came outside, she looked up cheerfully and said, "Good morning, neighbor. Beautiful day, isn't it?" "Linda, what are you doing?" Oh, just enjoying the morning air. This is such a nice spot, good view of the street. Morning sun, but not too much. I can see why you like this driveway so much. The absurdity of the situation was almost comical, except for the fact that I was essentially being held prisoner in my own home. I couldn't get my car out, and Linda was making it clear that she planned to occupy my driveway indefinitely that afternoon. I called Officer Rodriguez again. When he arrived and saw Linda set up her car blocking my garage, her lawn chair positioned in my driveway, and her boom box still playing children's music, his expression shifted from professional politeness to barely contained irritation. "Ma'am," he said to Linda, "we discussed this earlier this week. You cannot park on your neighbor's private property, and you certainly cannot set up furniture there." Linda stood up from her lawn chair with exaggerated slowness. "Officer, I've done my research since our last conversation. This driveway connects to a public street, which makes it a public right-of-way. I have every legal right to be here." "Ma'am, that's not correct. This is private property, and you're trespassing. I'm going to ask you one more time to move your vehicle and remove your belongings from this driveway." Linda's friendly facade finally cracked completely. "Are you threatening me?" "Because I know people at City Hall, and I know my rights." "You can't intimidate me into giving up my legal parking spot." Officer Rodriguez turned to me. "Sir, would you like to press charges for trespassing?" Before I could answer, Linda jumped in. "Press charges? For what? For parking legally? For sitting in a public space? This is harassment, and I'm going to file a complaint against both of you." I looked at Officer Rodriguez, who gave me a slight nod. "Yes," I said. "I want to press charges." What happened next was like watching someone have a complete mental breakdown in real time. Linda began screaming about police brutality, about how I was trying to steal her legal parking rights, and about how she was going to sue everyone involved. She refused to move her car voluntarily, so Officer Rodriguez called for a tow truck. While we waited for the tow truck, Linda continued her rant, but it became increasingly unhinged. She claimed that I had been spying on her through her bedroom windows, that I had been sabotaging her mail delivery, and that I was part of some neighborhood conspiracy to drive her out of her home. None of this was true, of course, but she seemed to genuinely believe her own accusations. When the tow truck arrived, Linda physically threw herself across the hood of her SUV, screaming that we were stealing her car. It took 2 more police officers and nearly an hour to resolve the situation. Linda was ultimately arrested for trespassing, disorderly conduct, and resisting arrest. I thought that would be the end of it. I was wrong. Linda was released on her own recognizance the next morning, and her revenge campaign began immediately. Over the next month, my life became a series of escalating harassment incidents that made the parking situation look like a minor disagreement. It started with my garbage cans. Every garbage day, I'd put them out at the curb the night before, and every morning I'd find them overturned, with trash scattered across my lawn and the street. The first few times, I thought it might be animals, but then I noticed that only my garbage cans were affected, and they were always overturned in the same systematic way. Then Linda began filing false complaints against me with every city department she could think of. I received visits from code enforcement officers investigating reports that I was running an illegal business from my home, that I had unpermitted construction, that I was violating noise ordinances, and that I was keeping unlicensed animals. Every complaint was investigated and found to be false, but each investigation was time-consuming and stressful. The harassment escalated to my workplace when Linda somehow found out where I worked and began calling my office, claiming to be a client with complaints about my professional conduct. She told my boss that I had been embezzling money, that I was providing false financial advice, and that I had been inappropriate with female clients. Fortunately, my boss knew me well enough to recognize the cause as harassment, but it was still embarrassing and disruptive. Linda also began targeting my mail delivery. I'd find my mailbox stuffed with garbage, or completely empty on days when I knew mail should have been delivered. When I confronted the postal worker, he told me that a woman matching Linda's description had been telling him that I'd moved and to hold my mail at the post office. The most disturbing incident happened about 6 weeks into Linda's revenge campaign. I came home from work to find that someone had thrown eggs at my house and car, and had spray-painted the word "thief" across my garage door in red letters. I called the police immediately, and while I couldn't prove Linda had done it personally, Officer Rodriguez told me that several neighbors had reported seeing her in my yard around the time the vandalism occurred. That's when I realized I needed to document everything systematically. I installed security cameras around my property and began keeping a detailed log of every harassment incident, complete with photos, videos, and witness statements from neighbors who had seen Linda's behavior. The security cameras were a game changer. Within a week, I had video evidence of Linda dumping trash in my yard, attempting to break into my mailbox, and keying my car while it was parked in front of my house. Most importantly, I captured footage of her spray painting obscenities on my front door at 3 in the morning. Armed with this evidence, I went back to the police and filed additional charges against Linda for vandalism, harassment, and stalking. I also obtained a restraining order that prohibited her from coming within 100 feet of my property, but Linda wasn't done yet. Unable to physically access my property due to the restraining order, she began enlisting others in her campaign. I started receiving anonymous threatening letters in my mailbox, obviously written by Linda, but with no return address. She began posting negative reviews about my accounting services on every business review website she could find, using fake names and fabricated stories about poor service. Most bizarrely, Linda began spreading rumors throughout the neighborhood that I was a dangerous criminal who had threatened her life. She told anyone who would listen that I had connections to organized crime and that I was planning to have her killed. Several neighbors mentioned these conversations to me, expressing concern about Linda's mental state. The situation reached its peak when Linda hired a private investigator to follow me. I first noticed the same car appearing everywhere I went. Outside my office, at the grocery store, at the gym. When I confronted the driver, he admitted that he'd been hired by Linda to gather evidence of my criminal activities. That's when I decided to take legal action beyond just criminal charges. I hired a lawyer and filed a civil lawsuit against Linda for harassment, defamation, and intentional infliction of emotional distress. The lawsuit detailed every incident over the past 6 months, supported by photos, videos, police reports, and witness statements. The legal pressure finally seemed to break Linda's resolve. Her lawyer, clearly recognizing that she had no defense for her behavior, advised her to settle out of court. As part of the settlement agreement, Linda agreed to pay for all damages to my property, to cease all contact with me, and to move out of the neighborhood within 60 days. But even then, Linda couldn't resist one final act of spite. On her last day in the neighborhood, she left a note in my mailbox that read, "You may have won this battle, but you haven't won the war. I know where you live, and I don't forget. Watch your back." I immediately turned the note over to the police, and Linda was arrested again for violating the restraining order. This time, she spent a week in jail before being released with strict conditions that prohibited any contact with me, direct or indirect. Linda moved out of the neighborhood as agreed, and for the first time in 6 months, I felt like I could breathe normally again. The constant stress of wondering what she would do next had been exhausting, and I hadn't realized how much it was affecting my daily life until it was over. The aftermath of the Linda situation taught me several important lessons. First, that some people are genuinely unstable and will escalate minor conflicts into major wars rather than admit they're wrong. Second, that documentation is crucial when dealing with harassment. Without those security cameras and detailed logs, it would have been much harder to prove the pattern of Linda's behavior. Most importantly, I learned that standing up for yourself, even when it seems easier to just give in, is sometimes necessary to prevent small problems from becoming huge ones. If I had let Linda continue parking in my driveway without consequences, who knows how far her sense of entitlement would have grown. The house next door was eventually sold to a lovely retired couple who actually introduced themselves with homemade cookies and have been model neighbors ever since. Sometimes I see them working in their garden and remember how much I appreciate normal, respectful human interaction. I still have the security cameras installed, and probably always will. The experience with Linda made me realize how important it is to protect yourself and your property, even in neighborhoods that seem safe and peaceful. As for Linda, I heard through neighborhood gossip that she moved to a different state and was involved in similar disputes with new neighbors within months of relocating. Some people never learn, but at least she became someone else's problem. The whole experience lasted 6 months, but felt like 6 years while I was living through it. It's amazing how one person's unreasonable behavior can completely disrupt your sense of security and peace in your own home. But I am glad I fought back, documented everything, and didn't let her drive me away from my own property. If you're dealing with a similar situation with a difficult neighbor, my advice is to document everything. Involve authorities early and often, and don't try to handle it alone. Some people only understand consequences, and sometimes you have to be willing to enforce those consequences to protect yourself and your property. Looking back, what started as a simple request to move a car from my driveway turned into a 6-month nightmare that involved police, lawyers, and a complete disruption of my life. But in the end, justice prevailed, and Linda learned that there are consequences for harassing your neighbors and refusing to respect other people's property rights. I just hope whoever lives next to her now has better luck dealing with her than I did.